Motion for debate, safeguarding of children in schools. Baroness Jenkin of Kennington.
At least you didn't quote me, Des. At least you didn't quote me.
I'm keeping it for another thing.
It's hard to hear. Wait.
Okay. So we may start. My lords, may I start by thanking all noble lords who are participating today, and those 5 or 6, I think, who have had to scratch from the debate due to travel issues. I'm especially sorry that the noble Lady Baroness Mayer, who was taken ill overnight and is unfortunately unable to be with us today. The importance of safeguarding children is well established and considered to be vital in underpinning the operation of a safe and functioning society in the UK. So there shouldn't really be a need for us to have a debate about its importance at all in 2023. As a country, we should be able to protect all children from harm, both outside of school but especially within it. We have in place the protocols, the mechanisms, the routines. Schools should be able to facilitate children to explore ideas about themselves and the world in ways which do not harm them. But children today find themselves facing a tidal wave of troubles and challenges. Poor mental health, body image issues, violent pornography and online bullying for starters. Our children are unhappier than ever. What has gone wrong? The government's definition of safeguarding encompasses a holistic range of measures that must be met to ensure children are safe, healthy and able to flourish. Working together to safeguard children defines safeguarding as protecting children from maltreatment, preventing impairment of children's mental and physical health or development, ensuring that children grow up in circumstances consistent with the provision of safe and effective care, and taking action to enable all children to have the best outcomes. Outside of the home environment, there is nothing more formative for a child than their experience at school. Consequently, parents place profound trust in schools, not just to provide their child with an education, but to protect their mental and physical safety too. In turn, teachers and schools take on great responsibility, a responsibility that goes well beyond the planning, preparation and delivery of lessons, the marking of work and focus on academic development. All of those working with children in schools fundamentally shape the environment in which they grow up and are responsible to ensure that this environment is, at a minimum, not harming them. This speech starts from the belief that teachers, parents and carers are united in wanting the best for children, but the world has changed beyond recognition since the legislative framework for safeguarding was introduced. And as well established as safeguarding protocol is in this country, it must be able to adapt in the light of new safeguarding risks facing children today. Safeguarding is the responsibility of everyone who comes into contact with a child and their family. It's thanks to my noble friend Baroness Bottomley of Nettleston, who I'm delighted to see in her place today, who as Secretary of State introduced the Children's Act in 1989, nearly 34 years ago, during which time the world has changed beyond recognition. But it's thanks to her that we have the legislative framework for the requirements and expectations of child safeguarding in England, and reinforced by the subsequent legislation in 2004. Section 11 of the Children's Act 2004 states that any organisation or function providing services to children is legally required to promote their welfare and to safeguard them. The government bolsters this legislation with several statutory documents which set out safeguarding duties on schools. The Office for Standards in Education, Children's Services and Skills, Ofsted, highlighted in its 2017-22 strategy that even more important than ensuring young people are learning well is ensuring they are kept safe. Ofsted expects every school to have a culture of safeguarding, and a school should be deemed automatically inadequate if these measures are found to be ineffective. Now, even though this only occurs in a tiny minority of schools, Ofsted considers safeguarding to be an utmost priority. So what does this actually mean in practice? Several things. Schools are required to work closely and cooperatively with appropriate local authority partners in a local community to ensure no child is able to slip through the net. They are required to adopt it could happen here mentality, which works from the fundamental premise that every adult has the potential to harm a child. Safeguarding does not accept that simply because someone appears harmless, they can be considered to be so. Information sharing is foundational to this. Schools are not in the business of keeping secrets. A teacher should never ever promise confidentiality to a child, and the government provides 6 information sharing principles for child practitioners, including accuracy, security and timeliness. Another vitally important safeguarding measure is the importance of parental responsibility. The law is clear that no other body is to assume parental responsibility for a child unless the court intervenes. While there are exceptions, parents are accepted to be the most emotionally, socially and financially invested in the welfare of children. Those who have parental responsibility for a child should be empowered to make decisions about that child. So we clearly have the infrastructure designed to make sure we keep children safe. So why are Britain's children unhappier than ever? According to the NHS, in 2017, 1 in 9 children between 7 and 16 had a probable mental health disorder. By 2020, that number was 1 in 6. In 2022, we are talking about 1 in 4 young people aged 17 to 19 reporting mental health issues. 1 in 8 children report being bullied online through social media platforms. Our mental health services for children and young people are in a dire state, with the children and young people's mental health services buckling under the burden of demand. Does the government have any plans to develop and implement a strategy to tackle mental health in schools? Ofsted reports that peer-on-peer sexual abuse at schools is on the rise. Sexual harassment is prevalent in schools and is more prevalent by boys to girls. This is unsurprising given the normalisation of sexual violence in online pornography and the role this is playing in shaping a child's understanding of sex and relationships. As the Children's Commissioner reported in January of this year, the average age at which children are first seeing pornography is 13. 10% of children surveyed first saw porn aged 9. As I'm sure we'll hear later in the debate, the impact of pornography on destroying young minds cannot be understated. Anyone who doubts this should look on YouTube at a film called Raised on Porn, which explains the effect on a child's brain of watching pornography at an age when they are unable to compute what they are seeing. Age verification brought in with the Online Safety Act should go some way towards resolving this, but the normalisation of porn consumption among young people is nothing short of a safeguarding catastrophe, although I'm not, of course, blaming schools for this. Social media and smartphones have become an integral part of lives of children and teenagers. This is 24/7. No longer are children likely to be kicking a football around the school field or chatting in the canteen at lunch. Instead, they are disassociated from the real world around them, plugged into an online world with limitless boundaries and unfettered access to potentially dangerous actors across the world. As put by psychology professor and expert Jonathan Haidt, childhood has been rewired. His research suggests that social media is making children more fragile, angrier, and more likely to take offence. This is having a particularly damaging effect on girls. Yet some schools still allow children to walk around the school corridors glued to their smartphones. If the damaging is so clear, why are we not seeing this as a safeguarding issue? I welcome the Secretary of State for Education's pledge to issue guidance cracking down on the smartphone use in schools, and I ask my noble friend the Minister when this guidance is likely to be published. As well as the proliferation of poor mental health, porn and social media, many schools are adopting an ideological approach towards sex and gender and issues around identity. This is leading to a violation of trust between parents and teachers. According to a report by Policy Exchange, 69% of schools are not reliably informing parents when a child experiences gender distress at school, and 25% of children are being taught they can be born in the wrong body. As Dr. Hilary Cass has said in her interim report into services for gender distressed children and young people, Social transition is not a neutral act, and some schools are breaking the safeguarding rules, legitimising withholding vital information from parents, promising confidentiality to children, and compromising single-sex spaces, most vital for both sexes in navigating the trials and tribulations of puberty. Ultimately, schools risk usurping the roles of parents when it comes to navigating highly sensitive cultural issues such as sex, race and gender. Schools have an obligation to remain politically impartial when teaching these issues, but we know they are not always doing this. Statutory guidance exists, but many believe it needs to be stronger. Could my noble friend confirm whether this guidance is under review and likely to be updated? I'm sure we all understand the pressures on teachers who have an enormous responsibility of discharging safeguarding duties as well as providing academic education. The way that closing schools during the pandemic has devalued the education system in the collective consciousness of the public has resulted in a sense that school is an optional extra, with huge numbers of society's most vulnerable severely absent from school and parents willing to take children out of schools for reasons such as politics and holidays. Would my noble friend consider enabling schools and academy trusts to issue fixed penalty notices for poor attendances? Again, I don't underestimate the pressure teachers are under. So is my noble friend aware that teachers are being called up for jury service with no concern about the impact on both them and the children they teach? Would she consider raising with colleagues in government whether teachers could be exempt from jury service during term time, or create guidance for the courts to ensure teachers are not taken out of school at critical times, leaving children untaught for lengthy periods? Like many noble lords, I hear from parents and teachers asking, how can we let children be children? For my generation, and I think I'm still just below the average age in your lordship's house, that's what we were. We read Ladybird books. We learned to read from Janet and John. Our crazes, our social contagions, if you like, were potty putty, gonks, hopscotch, and the most edgy thing we did in the break at school was play kiss chase. That was about the most extreme as it got. And thankfully for my own children's generation, there was no social media. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that people of our generation and my children's didn't experience bullying and violence and abuse, but they thankfully escaped the online world which children and their teachers and parents today have to navigate. Quirky children are like quirky adults. They should not be bullied or picked on for being different. Whether red hair, sexual orientation, gender non-conforming, they should be supported to be themselves as they develop from childhood to adulthood. I know my noble friend, the Minister, will share all of our concerns about the well-being of our children in schools. We cannot afford to drop the ball on safeguarding, even if that means admitting that mistakes have been made. Society is constantly evolving, and issues which didn't previously exist or may previously have been thought harmless or negligible should now be re-evaluated in the light of safeguarding duty. Children deserve to be children and to grow in and mature in school knowing they are safe from harm. They are already paying the price, and it must stop. Yeah.
The question is that the motion be agreed to.
My Lord, I very much welcome this debate and congratulate Baroness Jenkins on securing it and introducing it so effectively. I think she started by talking about the importance of safeguarding children, and whatever else we disagree on today in this chamber, I think we would all accept that that is absolutely vital, and we have an obligation to make sure that it is as effective as possible. I agree with the thrust of her arguments completely. I take the view she does on many of the issues that are facing society and schools now. I just want, in the time I've got, to take up one or two points. It's important to remember that we've got awful things still happen, but safeguarding in schools is far better than it was when I started teaching. We know now what risk children have. And I think the truth is that for many children, schools are the safest places in their lives. So huge progress has been made. And I think we ought to acknowledge that, because it is an extra burden of teachers, and it is a skilled job. You have to learn to do it. And I was teaching during that period of having to learn to do it. And it's not easy because it's about changing your culture. By the time you've got to an adult, it's quite difficult to change your culture. And one of the ways in which that culture has been changed over 20 to 30 years is that partnership between government and schools, where society has decided what it wants to accept, and government has passed legislation and issued guidance so that schools have a framework in which they can make decisions. And I think that's why it's improved, without being complacent about what still needs to be done. So I want to take up the issues that the Noble Baroness Jenkins said of where we've not got it right, and just not dismiss, but just comment on one very briefly. Online risk is terrible, what happens. I don't know how schools deal with it, given the tight-knit communities that they are. But at least now we've got agreement in adult society that we've got to do as much as we can to change it and to offer protection for children. And we've got the beginnings of a legislative framework whereby that can happen. So I want to move on to the issue of sex and gender and self-ID in children and schools, and ask why we've not got that adult agreement, what we want for our children, and we've not got the legislative framework, and we've not got the guidance which gives that secure framework against which teachers can make their decisions. Because that's what's happening. The good we've achieved has been through guidance and legislation and adults agreeing what's best for children. And that's not happening in the issue of whether children and young people should be able to self-identify their sex and schools whether they should support them or not. And while we're dithering about issuing guidance and wondering what we should do on this very difficult issue, teachers are picking up the pieces every day in their schools. And it's not just the odd school, it's not just one school in 10, it's every school where these difficult conversations are taking place and where children are growing up asking themselves these questions, and teachers are trying to discharge their responsibility to help them without the framework to guide them. So they're dealing with issues like whether they should have single-sex spaces in changing rooms when a male pupil identifies as a woman and as a girl and wants to access the safe space. They're having to decide issues like sport, where weight and stature matter, and so we've got single-sex sports. They're having to decide to children whether they can change their pronouns. They're having to make decisions as to whether they should advise a child to refer to a gender identity clinic. And they're even having to make decisions as to whether they should keep it a secret or whether they should talk to a parent. Now, this isn't an easy issue for adults. I completely understand that. But we shouldn't leave it so that we're creating such uncertainty for teachers. Many teachers have their own views. They're conflicted in what they should say to the children in their charge. And even where the national curriculum says something what I think is as straightforward as there are two sexes and children should be taught that in biology, some teachers don't know now whether they should be doing that because of the lack of guidance and advice that they're getting. They're dealing with pressure groups who have opposite ideas to each other, and they are essentially taking the legal risk because it's them who's at risk of being accused by parents of teaching things that they don't want their children to learn, because as an adult society and as government, the framework has not been presented to them. Look, young people, it's a difficult time growing up when your body's changing. We've all been through it, we have children and grandchildren who are going through it. It is not easy. And many young people have a very difficult relationship with their body. But I don't think they should be encouraged to think that changing their sex is an answer to those dilemmas. And yet what we see in the last 10 years, the number of girls who have been identified to referred to a gender identity clinic has gone up from 32 to 1,740, and boys from 40 to 626. Now, I don't know why that's happening. I've read the theories, I can hazard a guess, but I do know that those children are in someone's school. They've got teachers in charge of their pastoral and academic well-being, and we're not giving them the guidance to enable them to make effective decisions. And my own view also is that sometimes you think, well, let's go for a halfway house and let's permit social transitioning, but not, as I think we won't do now following the CAS report, refer children for puberty blockers. But once you start children on that journey, you may cause them psychological damage. What we also know is that the number of children who are referring to gender identity clinics are statistically far more likely to have mental health issues or be on the moderate to severe autism spectrum. And children change their minds. Thank goodness they change their minds. It's part of growing up. But we shouldn't make them commit, enforce that commitment so that it's difficult to change their minds if they do change their minds later on. And it's not just the children who are perhaps asking these questions and wondering whether they've been born into the wrong body that are suffering because of our lack of providing a legal framework. It's every children in the school. Because if safe-sex spaces and if sports are changed, it's every child who is affected by that. Last thing I want to say is this: as strongly as I might say that guidance is needed, and I hope it's being issued today and the Minister can say that, as long as I can say that and as strongly as I can say that, as strongly as I feel about children not being encouraged to change sex, I feel equally strongly that children must be listened to, whatever they say and whatever view they express, that they must be taken seriously and they must be supported. They must not be bullied, no matter how much how they present themselves, and links with parents must be maintained wherever possible. I genuinely hope that guidance is issued soon, and I genuinely hope that very quickly adults can give guidance to teachers about how they deal with the next generation.
My Lords, Baroness Brinton is taking part remotely. I invite Baroness Brinton to speak.
My Lords, I congratulate Lady Jenkin on securing this important debate, and I thank her for her comprehensive introduction. And it's a pleasure to follow Lady Morris of Yardley. Her time as Secretary of State put children at the heart of education, and she is right. Safeguarding today is much better than it was in the past. Safeguarding has a set of specific meanings regarding the protection of children and vulnerable adults from abuse, neglect and harm, defined, as Lady Jenkin mentioned, in the Children Act 1989, including protecting children from maltreatment, preventing the impairment of children's physical and mental health or development, ensuring that children grow up in circumstances consistent with the provision of safe and effective care, and taking action to enable all children to have the best outcomes. And Ofsted describes good safeguarding practice as the culture a school creates to keep its pupils safe so that they can benefit fully from all that schooling offers. A positive and open safeguarding culture puts pupils' interests first. Everyone who works with children is vigilant in identifying risks and reporting concerns. It's also about working openly and transparently with parents, local authorities, and other stakeholders to protect pupils from serious harm, both online and offline, and about taking prompt and proportionate action." End quote. The Times Educational Supplements guidance sets out the 7 core issues that school governors and staff need to keep at the forefront of their minds when considering safeguarding. And these include child sexual abuse and CSA material online, child-on-child sexual violence and harassment, which is sadly growing worse, extremism and radicalisation, domestic abuse, adverse childhood experiences, trauma, and last but not least, mental health. My Lords, 30 years ago, I held the portfolio for education and libraries on Cambridgeshire County Council. That summer, my new safeguarding responsibilities were brought home to me in a shocking case at one of our county's primary schools. A caretaker had been grooming and abusing Year 5 and 6 girls, and when parents complained to the head, the response was, no, our lovely caretaker could never do this. But he had. And as word went round the community, more and more former pupils and their parents came forward. The caretaker pleaded guilty, but many more children were abused because of preconceptions by those who should have protected them and investigated with the first complaint. I tell this story because too often our own prejudices can miss something absolutely key that merits, at the very least, investigation and listening to the child. That's why over the years I've welcomed the strengthening of safeguarding. Schools must be a place of safety for children. And sometimes, my Lords, that can mean safe from their parents too. One of the hardest things to do is to hear or suspect child abuse or child sexual abuse from within a child's home. Parents are not automatically involved in safeguarding reports regarding their children, as it is recognised that families are not automatically a safe environment for children, with some 1 in 14 children experiencing sexual abuse at the hands of their parents or guardians. And that, my lords, is why we need mandatory reporting for abuse, because children cannot stop abuse. Adults can. The independent inquiry into child sex abuse made a recommendation for mandatory reporting in their 13th recommendation, which would bring us nearer the vast majority of other nations. And a recent survey of 62 found that 80% of those nations participating had some form of mandatory reporting. Sadly, the government's response to the ICSA recommendations set out a very weak form of mandatory reporting with no statutory offence for failing to report. It isn't clear who will have the power to investigate or even to talk to the Disclosure and Barring Service. These and other proposals are too weak to have any effect on reporting rates. So can I ask the Minister why the government isn't following the examples, particularly of Australia, Canada and others where adults in schools report they are now more confident in raising suspicions to ensure investigation because of mandatory reporting frameworks? Mandatory reporting helps professional adults responsible for children by giving them a clear framework to take action. And by the way, my lords, this isn't just a schools issue. It should cover regulated activities such as sports. We are seeing far too many scandals outside schools. Turning to the safety of children who are LGBTQ+ and the proposals by some, which Baroness Jenkin mentioned, to add statutory notification to parents of any issues relating to their child. Experts say that creating an environment where a child is expected to suppress their part of their identity is increasingly regarded by medical practitioners as harmful. Allowing exploration in safe environments away from predetermined outcomes, also known as affirmative therapy, is almost always beneficial. And by the way, if the child wishes to walk back from their initial feelings, they can do so without any harm. But to ban it might cause further problems. Indeed, the government's own safeguarding guidelines, Keeping Children Safe in Education, says the fact that a child or a young person may be LGBT is not in itself an inherent risk factor for harm, and that LGBT children have protection from bullying and harassment under the Equality Act. It also says risks can be compounded where children who are LGBT lack a trusted adult with whom they can be open. If children and young people think they will automatically be outed to their parents, they may be less likely to confide in a trusted member of school staff, especially if they fear their parents having a hostile reaction. The NSPCC guidance on safeguarding for LGBT children and young people states, you should discuss options with the young person and their parents or carers as long as this does not put the young person at risk of harm. In conclusion, my lords, the government has made some good steps forward on strengthening safeguarding and guidance, but we must find a way to truly protect our children and young people through strong regulatory practice and ensuring that we continue to put children at the heart of safeguarding.
My lords, may I also warmly congratulate my noble friend Baroness Jenkin for initiating this important debate, and say what a pleasure to speak after two other such distinguished peers, Baroness Morris, who I've greatly admired for a long time, Baroness Brinton, all making incredibly important points. I was going to say I wasn't going to raise the issue of transgender, gender dysphoria and all the rest today, because I always know who I disagree with, and there are very few people I agree with. But I'd like to say that I entirely agree with the noble lady Baroness Morris. So if asked of my views, I shall simply send people her speech. The children need a stable, loving environment with consistent adults and long-term care. They need control as well as care. And of course, this should primarily come from the family. But for so many, it doesn't. So the school has a pivotal role and a changing role. As rightly said, the expectations on teachers and head teachers has grown monumentally. 40 years ago, I used to work with the man Peter Wilson, who then ran Young Minds, and we used to do training sessions for teachers. I was working at the Maudsley for teachers in inner city schools, coping with devastating children's situations, behaviour they couldn't understand, parental interventions which seemed to be absent. These teachers thought their job was to teach and were trying to get their heads around what was the right way to intervene, what was the right way to understand what was happening, how could they be helpful, what should they do. Well, now there is much greater clarity, and all the safeguarding rules and the role of the school and the guidance provided is definitely a big step forward. Initially, I was sceptical. When responsibility for children went from health to education, I was very uncomfortable. At health, I worked hand in hand with the noble Lord Laming, and his predecessor, Sir William Utting. And as a minister, I knew exactly what the social services inspectors were thinking, what was happening on the ground. I had to give evidence at the Lambeth Children's Inquiry the other day. And again, I completely referred to the social services inspectors who came to the top of the office meeting every week. Now at education, it is a much more fractured relationship. You have a children's commissioner, but it's not the same sitting at the same top table and understanding on a daily basis. Reference has been made to the Children Act, and there again I just paid tribute to our colleague Lord Mackay, as well as the person I worked very closely with, the noble lady Baroness Hale, in her early days, where she was a force on the Children Act. And it has stood the test of time, and I wonder why I'm able to share this. Every government and every party has new initiatives, new programmes, new sound bites, and were the government to change next year, which I think is most unlikely, I just hope any incoming government won't feel they have to start again and rebadge everything in their terms. Because what is needed for legislation is consistency. And the point about the Children Act was this extraordinary civil servant, Rupert Hughes, had years of consultation with the charities, with the local authorities, with others, took through the legislation, and then my job was largely the implementation, which was a lot of standing instruments and supplementary measures, again, consulting with the same people, so they'd all been on the journey, they could see what had happened, they would meet regularly together. But a new initiative, a new plan, it's what happens in the health service. People just despair. They thought they'd found an answer, and then, the whole thing crumbles. So, in praising those with whom I worked, I do also really celebrate what's happening now and greatly admire the effort and commitment at the Department for Education. Various themes come through. Social workers. It's a wretched job. Nobody thanks you for suggesting to a parent they might be abusing a child. Nobody thanks you for leaving a child with parents who were abusing a child. This is desperately emotionally draining and difficult. And they are subject to ritual social worker abuse whenever they get it wrong. So the work of Frontline of trying to improve careers and support for social workers is fundamental. Health visitors, the only people who it is legitimate to go and see children at home, take their clothes off, make sure they are physically well, play a crucial part. And it is, of course, all about the early years. What did the Jesuits say? Show me the child at 7 and I will show you the man. And turning a blind eye and waiting and delaying and hope it'll all be all right means that damage goes undetected, unseen and neglected. But of course, bringing up children is incredibly difficult. I see that with my grandchildren. I don't know how I ever was a mother. I probably was a very bad mother. And my grandchildren have grandparents and uncles and aunts and a lovely place we can go on holiday and be together. It takes a village to bring up a child, yes. But a lot of people don't have a village. They don't have a grandparent. They don't have a husband. They don't have a consistent neighbour. And I simply cannot emphasise enough what we all need to do to help young parents cope. Margaret Harrison started Home Start, which is a wonderful organisation And Lord Keith Joseph, the man who made me a Tory for what it's worth, who believed in the cycle of deprivation, that's what he talked about. And what did he say about education? He said the closest thing you have in education to a magic wand is the quality of the head teacher. That must be right. And the responsibilities and the leadership they have is absolutely enormous. I did want to touch on mental health. It's a huge problem, and that we have to give it greater focus and understanding. A fifth of children have been leaving school without even the most basic qualifications. And too many are excluded. Your education is your passport for the future. If you can't read and write, as all magistrates like me would know, the number of children who in court simply can't read the oath, they haven't a hope going forward. So actually making sure that we give better alternative provision to those who are often slung out of school because they're an absolute nuisance in school and left to wander the streets, and have those who need education most are getting the least. I want to commend the online safety bill, but I dare not. I'd like the noble lady to have another debate on the subject so we can all say the things we really wanted to say. But congratulations to her again.
My Lords, I also join with everybody in congratulating my noble friend in securing this vital debate, and also on her excellent and clear opening speech. And it's certainly an honour to follow my noble friend Baroness Bottomley of Nettlestone. My Lords, safeguarding in schools is highly complex and varied, and I will only touch on two areas today relating to the need for neutrality in our education system. Neutrality implies tolerance for a multiplicity of views. It is therefore precious but fragile and should itself be safeguarded. Starting with the school strikes against the action in Israel and Gaza, I declare my interest as the Christian Vice Chair for the Council of Christians and Jews. It was founded in 1942 by Archbishop William Temple and Chief Rabbi Joseph Hertz when the Holocaust was devastating European Jewry. Her late Majesty the Queen was patron throughout her whole reign. These strikes raised serious safeguarding concerns, with hundreds of children leaving the security of school in lesson time for political protests in towns and city centres. Parents and teachers have very little control over who children meet or what they are exposed to, despite schools' legal safeguarding duties set out in DfE statutory guidance, keeping children safe in education. Large crowds and a politically charged atmosphere mean any school authorising pupils to attend a protest during school hours cannot be fully in control of the risks to safety and welfare. Schools also risk breaching the prevent duty, requiring them to, quote, to help prevent the risk of people becoming terrorists or supporting terrorism. This includes safeguarding learners from extremist ideologies and radicalisation extremism, allowing children's exposure to potentially genocidal or anti-Semitic slogans like "From the River to the Sea" without countervailing views is the very opposite of safeguarding or good practice, which requires schools to maintain political neutrality. Ideas must be introduced and then discussed in the round of their historical and political complexity. This is how lesson time on these highly vexed issues should be spent. We need young people to be interested in and well informed about politics. Stating political positions as self-evident facts intimidates learners and shuts down debate. Can my noble friend the Minister inform the House if guidance requires ideological issues to be introduced in a well-rounded and nuanced way? Is her department investigating how, precisely, children became involved in these school strikes, how they were made aware of, and then joined public protests outside the school gate? Similarly, is the department investigating how extreme trans ideology, which presents schools with significant safeguarding concerns, was allowed to be adopted as fact when it too is far from neutral? Teaching children, including in early primary school, about gender fluidity further entrenches the sexualization of childhood, conjoined as it often is with sex positivity. The fact of the legal age of consent seems to be ignored, despite the key safeguarding reasons underlying it. Our zeitgeist is deeply rooted in the notion that the development of sexuality is indispensable to identity. This is not some fundamental human truth, but the idea of Sigmund Freud. Quoting Keynes, ideas, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. The education system should be a bulwark against pernicious ideas evolving into domineering and bullying ideologies, and not simply affirm both them and the young people persuaded by them. I'm not using the word ideology as a slur against a way of thinking that is simply different to my own, but in the Althusserian sense of ideology representing the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. Extreme trans ideology states, I am what I feel, irrespective of my biology. It is the epitome of expressive individualism and detached from reality. I draw a key distinction between gender dysphoria, where sufferers and psych professionals know there is something wrong, and ideological dispositions held, for example, by bodily intact males who intend to remain so, but feel they are female and aggressively demand to be treated as such. Schools should not consider themselves bound by the individual's desire to have this imagined reality validated, even if parents are on board with it. Parents cannot dictate how schools are run for the sake of their child. A decision to affirm a child's chosen rather than biological identity affects the whole school. Other children can feel or even be genuinely coerced into affirming an individual's imagined reality. It confuses young children and stifles the development of older children's critical capacity. Elsewhere, their education requires them to be led by facts and evidence, but in this particular area, feelings trump all else. The potential for harm to the young person who wants to socially transition is a major safeguarding concern. Social transitioning is the first step on the road to physical and pharmaceutical changes that will last their whole lives and are often deeply regretted. I end where I began, with the need for neutrality. Dr. Hilary Cass, as we've heard, concluded that social transition is not neutral, but a major psychosocial intervention that may affect whether a child's gender distress disappears or becomes long-lasting. In this age of affirmation, the ideologically driven imperative to be kind has blinded schools to their foundational safeguarding responsibilities. Will the DFE guidance make that clear?
Yeah. My Lords, I thank the noble Baroness for obtaining this important debate. My focus today is on sport. I speak as the father and grandfather of girls and boys who are and have been active in sport. In making this speech, I am grateful for the great help I have received from the charity Women in Sport. Sport develops important fundamental movement skills. It shapes attitudes towards physical activity. Sporting activity is essential if we are to turn our children into adults with healthy lifestyles. Today, we too often fail in this. We must do better, or we will have a lot of fat, unhealthy adults. To effect this, we must start at primary school level. There, teachers and coaches must recognise that there are important differences, even at that age, between the sexes. Even before puberty, the evidence is plain that boys have a physical advantage. Innate testosterone gives speed, strength, and stamina. Young boys will generally, not always, but generally, be slightly faster and stronger than girls, and that applies throughout the primary school age bracket. So to avoid demotivating girls, primary schools must recognise and act on this, giving girls the chance to compete against other little girls. At secondary level, the biological impacts of puberty really kick in. Boys grow much taller, stronger, and with greater cardiovascular capacity than their female classmates. But for girls, the physical changes of puberty often create embarrassment and awkwardness. Periods become a barrier to becoming active. As if that were not enough, in mixed sport, girls simply lose the chance to win, to build self-esteem, and even to have safe sport. Teenage mixed sport damages confidence and, worse, risks physical health. To safeguard girls, they must be offered proper female sporting opportunities. Difference in sporting performance between boys and girls and strength means that girls will not win races if they do not have their own. In team sports, football, hockey, rugby, cricket, it becomes a safety issue. In secondary schools, girls must not have to share their changing rooms with boys, including, if necessary, trans-identifying boys. Teenage girls must have privacy. It's a stated aim of all the sports councils funded via the DCMS to try to get more girls active and to keep them active. Mixed-sex sport in schools undermines that goal. The Childwise Monitor report of August 2022 found a significant gender gap in access to sports. For example, only 33% of girls aged 11 to 16 said they play football in school. That is to be compared with 63% of boys. So single-sex sport is fundamental to fairness, to safety, and to participation. Mixed-sex sport can have an adverse effect on girls, even in primary schools. Let me quote one or two examples of what parents with primary school children have said. On sports day, all our races were mixed. No little girls won anything. My daughter said, "What's the point?" Olympic swimmer Sharon Davis, MBE, says she gets messages all the time from parents and coaches who are afraid to say anything publicly about this. School sports days are being made co-ed because they don't want the hassle of dealing with the trans issue. I repeat, girls-only sport sessions are fundamentally important because they encourage participation. Those in authority in schools really must take this seriously and act to protect and encourage our girls. Effective safeguarding in schools includes and must include sport. This means recognising the physical differences of the two sexes and giving practical effect to what is needed. Thank you.
My Lords, it's a pleasure to follow Lord Sandhurst, and I would like to introduce him to my 12-year-old daughter if he feels that girls can't compete against boys at sports. I would also like to thank Baroness Jenkin for giving us the opportunity to talk on such a vital topic, and I can only stand here and admire the expertise in the chamber. To say that safeguarding in schools is important is like saying it's useful to be able to breathe. So I'm going to assume that we all agree on this basic point. My Lords, as I believe the only working teacher in both Houses of Parliament, I thought I would give you my view of safeguarding from the trenches, as it were. I work in a very high-performing school in a challenging part of Hackney, which incidentally bans mobile phones. As Peter J. Hughes, our CEO, wrote in his recent book on school leadership, and I quote, "Children in our Hackney community die. Children in our Hackney community are often routinely stopped under Operation Trident. Children in our Hackney community are strip-searched and subjected to adultification in presumed places of safety. I am very aware that these are three very powerful statements, but they are true, and that every carer's, parents, teachers, principals, CEOs and community's worst nightmare. It is something we cannot and will not ignore," unquote. So it is against a backdrop like this that a school has to get its safeguarding right. Safeguarding is everyone's responsibility. This is drummed into us repeatedly. Teachers, ancillary workers, students. A change of behaviour in the playground, a dirty shirt collar, or a new pair of trainers can be an indicator of abuse or grooming. Every one of those has to be reported, for it could be the final part of a jigsaw puzzle. Playgrounds are great places to spot how a behaviour has changed. A pattern has emerged, a gang has formed, a student has been isolated by online bullying. This is the front line, the short-term reaction. But in fact, safeguarding is more than that. Schools should be fun places where pupils want to learn and teachers want to teach. And can only succeed in this when we begin to get some of the 1.8 million children who, according to the Children's Commissioner, regularly miss school back into regular attendance. And on this topic, I would like to ask the Minister to comment on the Children's Commissioner's call that every school should have a legal duty to report their attendance daily. As the government's guidance says, it is about the culture a school creates to keep its pupils safe, so that they can fully benefit from all that schooling offers. And that can be as simple as not setting an essay question, a trip to the beach, or a walk in the woods. Because for a significant amount of children, they will not have experienced this, and they could feel isolated. We are told not to celebrate the end of term, because for many children, school holidays signal the end of any structure to their life, including a hot meal, and a descent into chaos or just sheer boredom. And for the majority, this is not abuse in the classic sense. It is just that parents and carers are too busy or too distracted to provide more than the basics of life without any further stimulation or companionship. Schools are where students can receive kindness from their friends and from their teachers and build and nurture relationships. Any teacher will tell you that it is the genuine connections with students that make them go to work each day. But it is also about the environment of the school. The head teacher of my school, Rebecca Warren, always talks about the broken window syndrome, whereby if something is left unfixed, be it damage or graffiti, more serious damage will follow. We underestimate the impact that school surroundings make on students. If small damages go unrepaired, then there is a sign of more substantial malaise in the school. I think we also underestimate the subconscious effect on students that if the school doesn't care about the building, then it doesn't care about them. This is one thing that doesn't require much money, just organisation. The worry is this could be another as yet unseen consequence of the RAC saga. Safeguarding needs to be baked into the curriculum, and this is where government and schools can do more to help changing behaviours in students and thereby helping from within. There are some lessons that need to be threaded through the term rather than just saved for PHSCE, the one a term day when these topics are normally discussed. Many parents and children see this day as another inset day, particularly those who hold beliefs that are challenged by the subject studied. Then surely they are the students who would most benefit from a balanced debate on such subjects. Tender is a charity that uses drama workshops to provide a safe space where young people can rehearse for real-life scenarios and recognise what makes something healthy or unhealthy behaviour. By using this in drama lessons, say in Year 7, that all students study, then all students can get a deep understanding of the issues. This could be more useful than a lifetime of PHSCE days. And I'd be interested to hear the Noble Lady, the Minister's view on embedding more strategies for safeguarding and general well-being into the curriculum rather than on drop-down days. My Lords, I've been trying to be as optimistic as I can around this subject, and I agree with Baroness Morris of Yardley that things have improved, and there are great stories of great people doing great work. But while there are so many children living in poverty, a school is limited in what it can do. I spoke to a safeguarding lead recently, and they said if they were some of these children today, particularly the boys, then they would be in a gang. For so many of them feel that this is the only way that they can earn the money, perhaps from their family, or even for a new set of trainers, because they see no other way out beyond starting to carry packages for cash. My Lords, we have a lot of work to do.
My Lords, I'd like to start by thanking my noble friend Lady Jenkin for securing this debate, and all other noble lords for their insightful contributions. Along with my noble friend Lord Sandhurst, I'd like to share a few reflections on the role that safeguarding plays in an area that goes hand in hand with the educational setting, that of sport. Safeguarding is at the heart of what sport embodies, ensuring fair play in a safe and fun environment. For teacher, think coach. For pupil, think athlete. For parent, well, they're irreplaceable. As a parent of children that are in school and ones that take part extensively in curricular and extracurricular sport, I have to declare an interest. I also sit on the other side of the fence, so to speak, in that I'm on the management group of one of our highest performing Olympic sports. I'm also chair of one of our sports national governing bodies in the UK and sit on the finance committee of its international federation. Alongside performance, safeguarding is at the core of what we do. In the short time we've available, I won't be able to do justice to the vital work that UK Sport and colleagues in other national governing bodies are doing in this important area. Just last week, I attended their annual PLX conference, and one of the sessions was dedicated to this precise topic, safeguarding in sport. Sarah Powell, CEO of British Gymnastics, and Andy Salmon, CEO of British Triathlon, are spearheading this on behalf of UK Sport. One of the key concerns that all sports are facing, because of the complexity and jeopardy involved with safeguarding, is that coaches are losing the confidence to coach. And I'm sure educators would say that teachers are also losing the confidence to teach. The issue is that all sports, whether dealing with adults or children, not just those that have a robust regulatory framework to work within, they all need to become safeguarding compliant. We need to require minimum safeguarding standards for any sport, particularly those taking place in an educational or informal setting. Those of us involved in the governance of sport are committed to ensuring the highest standards of integrity, welfare and safeguarding across all sport. We're all clear that anyone who doesn't want to abide by these standards is not welcome in sport. We all know how important sport is to the nation, and particularly to children. Education is crucial to people's mental health, sport to their physical health. I won't rehearse the arguments that place sport at the centre of our national well-being and our psyche. So, my Lords, at its heart, safeguarding is about the protection of people, in this case, children. However, protecting children also protects the adults that interact with children. The NSPCC's Child Protection in Sport Unit definition states, safeguarding refers to the process of protecting children and adults to provide safe and effective care. Governmental institutions in terms of education and national governing bodies in terms of sport need to harmonise. All international and national governing bodies have leadership roles to play, to provide and be provided with guidance and best practice. enabling convergence of policy and legislation. This brings me on to a topic that I spent quite a bit of time on, albeit through the lens of sports governance: gender versus sex classification in sport. Some simple concepts that I feel will help build an understanding of this sometimes complex and confusing subject. Gender can be fluid, with up to 107 identified to date. On the one hand, whilst biological sex is essentially binary, determined at birth, known as birth, natal, or assigned sex, there are further complexities in defining sex. So how do we, and should we, make sense of this complexity? Quite simply, really, key here is that within safeguarding, there has to be a protected characteristic. In sport, that is female, both from a competitive standpoint and in terms of social and environmental construct. The reason why we have biological male and female categories, not erroneously men's and women's, terms generally used in gender identification, is that females are considered to be disadvantaged physiologically. As we've heard from my noble friend Lord Sandhurst, even in amateur recreational sport, it is unfair and unsafe for them to play against biological males. Female sport, whether high-performance professional or recreational amateur, should be a protected category. I know from personal experience what it's like for my 8-year-old daughter, who, by the way, is no shrinking violet, to want to play football, but to have to do so in a mixed environment where she is the only girl. Again, as my noble friend also highlighted, this acts as a huge disincentive for young girls to play sport. Trans activists will try to claim that this amounts to discrimination. My clear response to that, in the performance environment, is that trying to exploit ambiguities within classification in sport is tantamount to doping. It's a form of cheating. A person who is born a male, even if they transition pre or post puberty, will always have a physiological advantage over a biological female. No amount of reassignment will change that. There will always be differences that lead to unfair advantages. Allowing a biologically male trans person to play alongside natal females, unless all players consent, or allowing that person access to female changing facilities, these are not safe practices. Consider when a male trans athlete causes a life-changing injury to a female player because of their vastly differing physiologies. Ask females what they feel about intact males entering intimate spaces, such as changing rooms. They feel extremely vulnerable and possibly violated. And I would suggest that if anyone allows this to happen, they are in a clear breach of safeguarding and promoting harm. I'm liberal-minded enough to believe that people should be able to express themselves in ways that they see fit, as long as it doesn't have an adverse impact on other people's enjoyment of life, or in this case, an activity in the educational or recreational setting. The key issue here is consent. People who are affected by an accommodation to allow a trans athlete to compete need to consent and not have it imposed upon them against their will by an ill-equipped governing body, or have the issue hijacked by extreme gender ideology and people with aberrant or criminal intent. Thank you.
My Lords, I join with others in thanking my noble friend Lady Jenkin for initiating this debate. And also I want to thank all contributors so far for their very thoughtful and helpful comments and ideas on this very difficult and complex subject. And I particularly wanted to thank Lord Hampton for challenging us with his interesting contribution. And as a previous teacher, I empathised a great deal with the things that you put into your debate contribution, so thank you. Safeguarding involves thinking the unthinkable. This does not mean that we always assume the worst, but we attempt to consider all possibilities and mitigate risk where possible. My Lords, we should not underestimate the role and importance single-sex places play in safeguarding. A simple policy that safeguards and protects girls when they are undressing, sleeping, or otherwise vulnerable is to provide a single-sex space such as lavatories, changing rooms, and dormitories. Yet, we are seeing numerous examples when this simple policy is being ignored, often under the guise of being progressive or inclusive. A recent report from the Policy Exchange found that at least 28% of secondary schools are not maintaining single-sex lavatories. This is not only a safeguarding issue, it is against the law. Under the School Premises England Regulations 2012, schools are legally required to provide single-sex lavatories and washing facilities for children over 8, except where the lavatory facility is provided in a room that can be secured from the inside and that is intended for use by one pupil at a time. If a school has changed all previous sex-separated facilities, mixed sex, without fulfilling this requirement, they are in breach of the law. We hear of incidents such as one at a school where the police were called over allegations that female pupils were sexually assaulted in its gender-neutral lavatories. Another where a teenage boy has been arrested over 4 allegations of serious sexual assault at Essex School, which was a newspaper reported that 3 of the alleged attacks took place in lavatories used by boys and girls. A secondary school has been criticised over its unisex lavatories policy after a teenage girl was injured when a male classmate allegedly kicked down a cubicle door to photograph her. Many schools are adopting policies that replace sex with gender and set rules which require staff and young people to ignore or make it taboo to talk about a person's actual sex if they prefer to be referred to as the opposite sex. This conflicts with safeguarding legislation and principles. Staff, pupils and parents raising safeguarding concerns about mixed-sex facilities, often introduced in an effort to get the approval of lobby groups, are dismissed as transphobic or pressured to use language that erases risk. Safeguarding systems cannot work where people are not able to speak clearly and openly about risks. Safeguarding is everyone's business, including that of society as a whole. By not utilising a safeguarding first approach, we are letting down our children. Perhaps it's time for a public inquiry. My friend Lady Jenkins and others have talked about how safeguarding is defined in working together. This child-centred approach is fundamental to safeguarding and promoting the welfare of every child. A child-centred approach means keeping the child in focus when making decisions about their lives and working in partnership with them and their families. Safeguarding and promoting the welfare of children is everyone's responsibility. Everyone who comes into contact with children and their families has a role to play. All practitioners should follow the principles of the Children Acts 1989 and 2004 that state that the welfare of children is paramount and that they are best looked after within their families, with their parents playing a full part in their lives, unless compulsory intervention in family life is necessary. Everyone who works with children has a responsibility for keeping them safe. No single practitioner can have a full picture of a child's needs and circumstances. And if children and families are to receive the right help at the right time, everyone who comes into contact with them has a role to play in identifying concerns, sharing information, and taking prompt action. Advice from lobby groups regarding keeping information about a child's distress confidential from parents, family, and other agencies, and refusing to share teaching materials with parents directly contradicts safeguarding guidance on information sharing. My Lords, everyone who works, fears about sharing information must not be allowed to stand in the way of the need to promote the welfare and protect the safety of children, which must always be the paramount concern.
My Lords, I'd like to join everybody else in thanking Lady Jenkin for securing time for this important and interesting debate. My Lords, I thought as an historian I might give your Lordships a brief oversight into the history of transgenderism, as I think it will help throw some light on the current debate. For the previous 30 centuries or so before the 1960s, while there's plenty of evidence of hermaphroditism and cross-dressing, there's been remarkably few people who genuinely believed that they'd become a member of the other sex from the one in which they were born. We have the Roman Emperor Heliogabalus, of course, from the early 3rd century AD, who the historian Dio Cassius says asked his doctors to change his sex. But there's no indication that he actually did, that they did this for him. And he had 5 marriages, 4 wives. One wife he married twice. And there's no real indication that he changed his sex, although the Hertfordshire, North Hertfordshire Council Museum has got him down with personal pronouns, female pronouns, that is. Then there was the very colourful Chevalier d'Eon in the late 18th century, who in 1777, at the age of 49, declared that he was a woman. And this was accepted by Louis the 16th and by the British courts, although it was comprehensively disproven at the time of his post-mortem. In the 19th century, the female Albert Cachier fought in the American Civil War as a man. And in 1952, in America, the first actual sex change took place, Christine Jorgensen. And then here in Britain, in the 1960s, in 1960 it was April Ashley, and in 1964 the historian Jan Morris, who I knew actually tangentially. But, my Lords, the very fact that we know these people's names, that they're well known to history, is, I think, indicative of how rare this phenomenon was. But then came the 1960s, when postmodernist thought posited that there's no such thing as absolute truth, and that if you feel something, or you feel that you think you feel something, then it is your truth, and that has equal validity to objective truth. And the objective truth, of course, is that whatever your sexuality that you choose, you have the right to choose whichever one you want. You genuinely can't change your biological sex. The terms transgender didn't come into existence until the 1990s. But in Britain today, there are 6 times normal Britons who speak to this about to their GPs are 6 times more likely to say they are transgender than they did 10 years ago. My Lords, this has all the hallmarks of a classic example of social contagion, in which the internet, smartphones and social media, the fashion and advertising industries, various pressure groups, TV programs, some doctors who undertake mutilating surgery on perfectly healthy bodies, have come together to create what is essentially a new ideology, one that's not anchored in the human experience of the past 3,000 years of recorded history. The result has been a breakdown in social structures where men are to be found in women's prisons, women's lavatories, women's changing rooms, as we've heard earlier in this debate, and women's sports, places where they do not belong and places where they have no right to be. And as with everything to do with transgenderism, common sense seems to fly out of the window. My lords, it's our duty to help teachers to safeguard children as much as possible from being unduly exposed to this historically new phenomenon, which we must of course tolerate because we are civilized people, but which ought to be extremely rare, as it has been for 3 millennia before our present age.
My Lords, Lord Shinquin is taking part remotely, and I now invite Lord Shinquin to speak.
My Lords, I thank my noble friend Lord Roberts of Belgravia for his important historical perspective, and I join with others in thanking my noble friend Lord Baroness Jenkin of Kennington, not just for securing this important debate, but also for her courageous commitment to facilitating balanced and well-informed consideration of such vital issues as protecting the integrity of women's sport, defending women's and girls' rights to safe spaces, and exposing, in many cases, the unintended consequences for women and indeed children of the affirmation of gender self-identity, whether in our prisons or indeed the classroom. I say courage because sadly it is essential in order to brave the bile and vitriol which anyone who has the temerity to challenge the cancel culture extremism seems to attract. We need only look at how J.K. Rowling, Mayor Forstater, Kathleen Stock, and Joanna Cherry, KCMP, have been treated to know just how true that is. My Lords, it's hard to think of anywhere where the extremism, in terms of the intensity of the battle that we've heard during the course of this debate, is going on for the hearts and minds of our young people, then how acute it is in the classroom and in schools. To all intents and purposes, they have become a battleground when anyone who has been through adolescence knows its torment enough without the complexity of considering whether you've been born in the wrong body or should change your gender. My Lords, I'm not a parent, nor will I ever be one. The very strong probability that any child of mine would have the same condition as I have precludes that possibility. Others with brittle bones make different choices, and I respect them for that. But I know I'm not strong enough to risk visiting upon anyone the pain, shame, and discrimination that I have experienced as a result of it. But an inability to speak as a parent should not disqualify me or anyone else from voicing concern about the threat posed to the integrity and effectiveness of safeguarding guidance by advice from lobby groups that information about a child's distress, perhaps about their gender, should be kept confidential from parents, family, and other agencies, and that teaching materials should be treated as confidential and not shared with parents. Surely this directly contradicts safeguarding guidance on information sharing. My Lords, as a disabled person, I have a personal vested interest in safeguarding progress towards greater equality, whether on the protected characteristics of disability, sex, ethnicity, or sexual orientation. Progress on each invariably impacts on the whole. Moreover, I'm sure we all have reason to be grateful for the courage of people like Simon Fanshawe, not just for co-founding Stonewall in 1989, but more recently for reminding us that, and I quote, spaces have to be safe for disagreement, not from disagreement. In other words, and I paraphrase, that cancel culture is counterproductive because extremism engenders extremism, which puts progress towards equality as a whole at risk. What I find remarkable is the extent to which the equality landscape has been transformed in the almost 3.5 decades since Stonewall's foundation, in no small part to its formidable campaigning. I say equality landscape because I would not be in the least bit surprised if many people saw issues such as equal marriage as almost a key performance indicator of society's attitudes towards equality per se. My lords, that is undoubtedly to Stonewall's credit, but having played so crucial a role in securing that progress, surely it has an equally key role to play, indeed a responsibility to safeguard progress towards greater equality. I'm not sure it appreciates that. In fact, Stonewall's ostracization of Simon Fanshawe and its unfortunate association with an aggressive, polarizing cancel culture, with the promotion of gender self-identity in our schools, and at best, an indifference to the erosion of women's and girls' rights to safe spaces, suggests the opposite. My lords, that's such a shame, because the extremism generated is inevitably provoking a backlash across the piece. In my experience as a disabled person, such a climate is legitimizing regressive attitudes towards and treatment of disabled people, which I thought was ancient history. Progress towards equality is so precious. History shows that it's also incredibly fragile. That is why safeguarding progress towards equality for future generations depends on our safeguarding the current generation of children and young people in school today.
My lords, it's an honor to follow my noble friend, Lord. My God, Shanklin, and just having called my friend. And I commend his continuous efforts to preserve and safeguard disability rights in this place and outside. My lords, may I thank Noble Lady Jenkins for her leadership for introducing this debate so powerfully on the exponential rise in children's suffering. I wish to make some general points about safeguarding and particularly about the impact of Prevent and Channel program on Muslim children. My lords, although not currently practicing, I've been a social worker since 1984, qualifying later, working mostly in East London. Keeping children safe, protecting their welfare require multi-agency response and structures, which includes social workers, police, health visitors, local safeguarding boards, and medical staff. And safeguarding has indeed evolved over the decades. Many will argue for the better, whilst many more will cite inadequate resources constraining available support families under duress urgently require. Around 3 million cases of child abuse are reported each year, with 5.5 million children involved. NSPCC alone has received this year 22,000 referral of children deemed unsafe. The House has debated childhood experiences of trauma on countless occasions, and we know all too well the poverty, physical and sexual abuse, drugs, caring responsibilities, experiencing racism and other form of discrimination, as well as witnessing violence in their home, pornography online, and bullying causes untold damage on their mental well-being. These facets are common amongst all our children across the UK. As with violence against women, such experiences are regardless of class, gender, race and faith. As an experienced social worker working with children and families, I am cognizant of the pressures of managing statutory intervention, which is complex, and one cannot overemphasize the trauma and anguish of all families, whether or not a family member may be perpetrator, causes immense turbulence on the child and their siblings. And it has to be said that on occasions, children from minority background, when cases are dropped or closed, was often due to profound lack of understanding in family nuances, cultural norms and practices, as well as languages, and frequently based on premises that somehow children, particularly young girls, was more vulnerable in parts to do with their race, culture or faith. In this context, I wish to raise some matters related to prevent and channel measures and duty, which requires all education providers to help prevent risk of people becoming terrorists, supporting terrorism, which then triggers a multi-agency response to safeguarding when children and young people are deemed vulnerable at risk of radicalization and extremism. Prevent duty extension to public bodies has led to young Muslim children in particular seen through the lens of securities. As a result, social workers, police officers, and perhaps even more some teachers, believing that children as young as 4 could be radicalized, equivalent to, my lords, in the womb, potential future terrorists, lie. And education institutions have been issued guidance which promotes some mendacious ideas that signs of radicalization may include reference to Allah Akbar, Alhamdulillah, which is equivalent to praise to be God, and international conflict, and especially Palestine, as we now see. Teachers without sufficient training or knowledge go as far as to suggest to children that prayers are not obligatory, and one Muslim Council of Great Britain report cites an example of science class on nuclear fission where making bomb is discussed, and a child of Muslim faith being the only one to refer to safeguarding concerns when he discusses this. Prevent has caused much misery and suffering, unnecessary misery and suffering for children and families. One report suggests 4,406 referrals to Prevent in the year to March 22. 76% of that were deemed not suitable in the end for channel consideration and exited the process, of which the majority 77% were signposted to other services, including educational and for health support. A report by Right Watch UK concludes that Prevent, and in particular the introduction of statutory duty on teachers, and I agree with them, and public servants to report signs of radicalization, is stifling fundamental rights and freedom of children, including to freedom of expression and belief. My lords, it dehumanizes many very young children and have detrimental impact on their mental health, self-confidence and trust in those they have, who have responsibility for their well-being. On many occasions, children are referred without knowledge or consent of parents. My lords, this is not about child sexual abuse or physical abuse. This is about children's thinking and behaviour. My Lords, there is clear need for safe space where young people can express their feelings and opinions without threat and fear of a safeguarding referral. Prevent process is obstructive and creates significant alienation and faith in the education system. To undermine young minds in such brutal manner violates trust and may cause their long-term mental well-being as well as detrimentally impact their education. We are familiar with the horrifying numbers of 1 in 6 children aged 5 to 16 identified as having probable mental health problems in ending July 2021. To now, 5 children in every classroom. As it's being said, NHS figure shows more than 1 million children needed treatment for serious mental health problems in the past year, as reported by Telegraph earlier this year. Children are the product of their environment, home and society. Information on international events will be visible to many homes, online, in schools and playgrounds, and certainly happening in school council debates all over the country. These matters must not shut down children of any background or faiths. It is incumbent upon us, all of us, to encourage children expressing their views without fear of punitive measures on them and their families. Building resilient children who are our future is an absolute obligation to which each of us must be united in order to ensure our common humanity and a peaceful society.
My Lords, the purpose of schools is to educate, but if there is an even more important purpose, it is to safeguard the children in their care. The vast majority of teachers take that seriously, but there are concerns that the education some schools are providing is actually a risk to children. We might even ask if education is the right word for it. When schooling is captured by an ideological agenda, it leads to poor, uncritical education, and schools can become blind to what really is in the best interest of children, or blind to the risks that they are exposing them to, especially on sexual issues. The Sex Education Forum is a sort of trade body for the sex education industry. They downplay these concerns, but you'd expect that because they are implicated in the failures that we're talking about. But safeguarding concerns should never be downplayed. Clear boundaries and transparency are key principles of safeguarding. If a concern is raised, it has to be properly investigated. The evidence must be examined, and those with responsibility for overseeing education must not allow themselves to be fobbed off by people claiming that they can be trusted and claiming that there's nothing to worry about. The source of the problem is third-party organisations which present themselves to schools as being experts. Organisations offering advice, training, teaching materials, and even external speakers to come in and deliver lessons. In reality, many of them are highly partisan campaign groups with agendas that conflict with some of the duties placed on schools. And regrettably, this radicalism has been prevalent in the sector for some time. Jessica Ringrose is a board member of Queering Education, a professor at UCL and an advisor to the School of Sexuality Education, which provides speakers. And she was a lead author on an academic paper, and I just want to read a few lines from the abstract. In this paper, we explore our experiences working as a team who have formed an intra-activist research and pedagogical assemblage to experiment with RSC practices. We draw upon fee materialism theory and socially engaged participatory arts-based research methodologies and pedagogies to explore 2 examples of arts-based activities that have been developed to de-centre humanist, male-dominated, phallocentric, penile-orientated RSE. And this, if I can beg the indulgence of the Lords, is from a journal called Reconceptualising Educational Research Methodology, and the article is entitled Play-Doh Vulvas and Felt-Tip Dick Pics, Disrupting Phallocentric Matters in Sex Education. They're not even pretending not to be activists. We should be much more sceptical about the materials that these organisations are producing. Ringrose's research boasts of one example where 12-year-old girls were tasked with working in groups using sexually explicit images some had received on their phones. These organisations know they're up to no good. I say that because the School of Education, Sexuality Education, was the organisation behind the Claire Page case. When she complained as a mum about what her children were being shown in sex education, the School of Sexuality Education told the school that it was not allowed to show the classroom materials to anyone, citing commercial confidentiality. Not being able to refer to the materials hampered her ability to effectively progress her complaint. Norfolk Council's scheme, a conservative council for primary schools, instructs children to make plasticine models to illustrate, quote, a condom catching semen from a penis, and gives inaccurate information about the age of consent. 6- and 7-year-olds in Warwickshire, a conservative council, were asked to discuss a scenario of a girl who enjoys touching herself between the legs when she has a bath. Thankfully, that programme was withdrawn by the council, but only under the threat of legal action. On gender ideology, in addition to the excessively explicit nature of some sex education, we now have the pervasive presentation of gender ideology as a fact. A lesson plan from the group Kapow presented children with a spectrum of stereotypical male and female interests. It instructed them to map their own so-called gender identity in relation to the spectrum. And then it told them to ignore what anyone else says to them about their gender and choose their own. My lords, this distancing of pupils from the influence of others, especially their own parents, is dangerous. It is in itself a safeguarding issue. Parents are often not aware of what is going on with their own kids in sex education. Even when they do, they are often made to feel powerless, and there seems to be a deliberate strategy to reduce the influence of parents over the education of their own children. Yeah. Some brave parents submit formal complaints, but it is hard for them to get anyone to listen to them and actually change anything. If they work through all the stages of a school's complaints process without success, and if they still have the energy to continue, they can escalate it to the Department for Education. But the department does not seem to handle these complaints well. In one case I've seen and have been made aware of, a parent has been waiting for well over a year for the DFE to respond substantially to an escalated complaint. And in another, the DFE says it received the complaint but then lost it. The parent printed it out again and posted it off 2 months ago. She is still waiting. Perhaps the Minister might agree to meet me to discuss these cases. It seems the DFE is effectively disempowering parents who are courageous enough to make a stand. And while they wait for a response to their complaints, children continue to be exposed to materials that their parents regard as unsuitable and harmful. The School of Sexuality Education contributed to 2 of the DFE's own RSHE training modules for teachers. So I'm afraid we have to ask the question as to whether the DFE has not itself been captured and compromised. In conclusion, the situation is a mess. It's imperative that the Secretary of State and her ministers get a grip and that they act urgently.
Yeah. My Lords, I start by congratulating the noble Baroness Jenkins of Kennington on her opening intervention, and there is very little within that I would disagree. I also want to associate myself with the powerful intervention of Lord Hampton, a teacher in the London Borough of Hackney, an area I know well. I live in Tower Hamlets, and I experienced my education for the most part in Tower Hamlets. Can I say at the outset, my Lords, I wasn't intending to say this, but elements of what I've heard today I find deeply troubling and remind me how people referred to me as a gay man across the decades, and what dehumanisation and defaming does. Yes, I say to the now noble Baroness shaking her head, defamation and dehumanisation is a threat to life. I experienced no safeguarding during my school years, and subsequently, as a queer, I experienced years of sexual and physical abuse until the age of 15. So therefore, for the avoidance of any doubt,
I am passionate about adequate and proportionate and essential safeguarding and empowering young people, especially those that belong to minorities. I also wish to refute the misrepresentation of Stonewall by the Noble Lord Shinkwin. Stonewall, an organisation I'm proud to be a co-founder of and which I still support. My Lords, it is absolutely clear to anyone listening to this debate or otherwise, and anyone taking the slightest interest in the area of safeguarding, of the importance of addressing the concerns that we have heard today, and addressing them with teachers and other professionals within the schools sector. It is vital that we engage the professionals and the practitioners in these areas and not leave it to the whims and wishes of others, offering generally nothing more than anecdotal evidence or allegations in the press. Due to current levels of interest in trans young people in schools, I wish to recall that 5 years ago, the government committed to producing guidance for schools to support, I repeat, support children who are questioning their gender. There are a range of views about how best to support young people, but, my Lords, clear consensus that guidance is needed. Just yesterday, during her statement in the other place, the Minister for Women and Equalities repeated her assurance that the guidance would be issued shortly. I hope this is not another characteristically empty promise from the government, and I would say to the Equalities and Women's Minister that it would be preferable to produce statements, external statements and within the House, and guidance on evidence and not on wild allegations. Safeguarding, as has been mentioned before, has a specific meaning regarding the protection of children and vulnerable adults from abuse, neglect and harm. It's also worth repeating that which Baroness Brinton said, that parents are not automatically involved in safeguarding reports regarding their children, as it is recognised that not all families, my Lords, are automatically a safe environment for children, with some 1 in 14 children experiencing sexual abuse at the hands of their parents or guardians. Again, repeating Baroness Brinton, creating an environment where a child is expected to suppress a part of their identity is increasingly regarded by medical practitioners as harmful. Preventing a child from accessing beneficial treatment can also be considered to be neglect or abuse, and therefore falls into the safeguarding concerns. A 2022 report by Gallup, the LGBT+ anti-abuse charity, found that 43% of trans people have suffered abuse at the hands of their family. And listening to some of the statements about trans people, one doesn't have to wonder too much why. Whilst another study of 2016 reported that family rejection has a positive correlation with both suicide attempts and substance misuse. And so, my Lords, to repeat, for the avoidance of any doubt, the safeguarding of children and young people must protect all children and young people without reservation or exclusion. And that includes LGBTQ+ people and non-binary and intersex. Furthermore, any relationship and sex education in schools must be inclusive, and there must be no attempt to create another Section 28, Section 2A of the Local Government Act 1986, which caused so much harm to so many people. Whilst recognising that most people hold their views seriously and sincerely, I wish to say this directly to the Minister. There must be no return to the prejudice and the hate of the past. It must be resisted on every occasion, and there should be no return to the ignorance, sometimes well-intentioned ignorance, that contributed to the fear which harm and damage so many young people. Dehumanisation and defamation do not safeguard anyone, and they result in crimes against the person because they are perceived as different. Trans people are not a threat. Law breakers, rule breakers are a threat. Yet, there are well-organised, well-funded campaigns to demonise, defame and misrepresent LGBT plus people, especially trans people, and that is utterly shameful. It will serve no good to anyone, and it will only continue to create misery and harm for LGBT plus young people, trans people and their families. Indeed, it undermines the very society in which we all live. As a civilised society, we need to protect vulnerable minorities. We need to protect young people and children who associate or belong within those minorities. Every child, every young person should have the inalienable right to be themselves authentically and without fear. Our futures depend on it. Indeed, their futures depend on it. Finally, I ask the Noble Baroness, the Minister, for an unequivocal assurance that any approach to safeguarding will be based on verifiable evidence and not on opinion nor anecdote. It is sad that I have to request this, but can I seek a categorical reassurance that no child or young person will be left behind? No child or young person, including LGBT+, non-binary and intersex, will be isolated, and that each child or young person will be enabled, indeed encouraged, to grow and achieve their unique potential and develop their own identity.
My Lords, that was a very impassioned speech by the Noble Lord Pashman. My apologies. I too had not intended to say this, and I want to make the point that I support minorities and the underdog. But 6 days ago, the Noble Lord Cashman, who we've just heard, tweeted on X, "The right wing in the House of Lords has organised a debate for the 7th of December on safeguarding in schools. We must push back against these people." What on earth did he mean? Might I suggest Debbie Hayton responded, the respected teacher and trans woman replied, "Pushing back against those concerned about safeguarding is maybe not what you meant, Michael." So, may I first congratulate my dear noble friend Viscount Stansgate upon sitting on the Woolsack for the first time. And may I also thank my noble friend and kinswoman Baroness Jenkin for securing this important debate. Schools are a place where children should be nurtured and nourished, a place of safety where they can grow up slowly, safe from the outside world and some of the more unpleasant and pernicious influences that inhabit our world and from time to time cross our path. Pornography is one of those influences I am sure that every noble peer, every person in this chamber would agree should not be available in schools. But I'm afraid it is, and it is readily available. In my day, as a red-blooded sixth former, you might chance upon a well-thumbed copy of Playboy or Mayfair, fairly benign fare. But now, due to the internet and the fact that so many children at the age of 12 or younger have smartphones, a huge panoply of pornography of every type is revealed and is so easily accessed. A young child merely has to tick the box stating they are 18 or over and they are in. Internet porn is readily available and there's much of it. Many, many more people are exposed to it and or choose to watch it in the anonymity of their own home, safe from prying eyes. And we know from many things that you find on the internet, it is very easy to head down the rabbit hole. It is the same with pornography, with increasing categories of depravity available. Think of the category rough sex and go further, where, always, young girls are abused, often by multiple men. I will stop there, but believe me, it gets worse. What is so worrying is the effect this increased viewing of hardcore porn is having, primarily on men. In the Times on Wednesday, it was reported that in a study by Edinburgh University's Child Safety Institute, when surveying 4,500 people from the UK, USA and Australia, that more than 1 in 20 said that they would have sexual contact with a child between the age of 10 and 14 if they knew it would be kept a secret. Among British men, 1.6% said they would definitely have sexual contact with a 12 to 14-year-old if it stayed a secret, with 2.6% saying it was very likely. An additional 7% admitted to having sexual feelings towards children but did not act upon them. The proportion was higher in Australia and higher still in America. According to the International Society for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect, 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 5 boys have been sexually abused, and that half of these children have been abused by their 13th birthday. I don't know the figures for the UK, but sincerely hope they're not that high. Dr. Michael Slater, Associate Professor at the University of New South Wales, that co-authored the report with Edinburgh University, stated that the rise in online child offences was part of a global trend over the last 2 decades, adding that an unregulated online environment was a direct cause of sexual offending against children. Men who are sexually offending children, he said, are watching a lot more online pornography. But also the type of content they are consuming is very deviant. It is more likely to be violent, it is more likely to be forceful. A report commissioned by the MP Miriam Cates in the new Social Covenant calling for a government review and entitled What is Being Taught in Relationship and Sex Education in Our Schools highlights how things have changed since the guidance produced by the DOV in the year 2000, which stated, what is sex and relationship education? It is a lifelong learning about physical, moral and emotional developments. It is about understanding the importance of marriage for family life, stable and loving relationships, respect, love and care. It is also about the teaching of sex, sexuality and sexual health. It is not about the promotion of sexual orientation or sexual activity. This would be inappropriate teaching. I think we'd all feel very happy with that definition of RSE. But this statement does not feature in the latest 2019 guidance, which contains advice that is not compatible with the definition. Indeed, now there is strong evidence that actors with a radical ideological position on sex, gender and sexuality are monopolising the RSE's third sector, as Noble Lord Jackson has said. And I shall give a couple of examples. He mentioned Jessica Ringrose from UCL, Amelia Jenkinson, former CEO of the School of Sexuality Education, and he mentioned Play-Doh vulvas and felt-tip dick pics. If your lordships will indulge me, children aged 12 to 16 were encouraged to draw sexually explicit images, including hands masturbating erections, with the words, "Wanna see me come," spelt C-U-M, and "Now it's your turn, ride me." The academics went on to recall there was a sense of solidarity amongst, this is ironic, solidarity amongst the girls as they discussed the pictures they had received from random old men on Snapchat. Really? Is that really acceptable? Certainly not, particularly for the 12 and 13-year-olds in the class who were needlessly exposed to this sort of thing, having mercifully never experienced it in real life. But it gets worse. Another provider, Splits Banana, gives lessons on to the same age children where it describes 4 types of sex: penis and vagina, oral sex, masturbation and anal sex. Their lessons created an equivalence for heterosexual couples between anal and vaginal sex, which has the potential to mislead children about whether anal sex is a universally enacted, desirable or safe sexual practice. I leave you with this. In preparation for this debate, I asked my own children at what age they'd first been exposed to pornography and how it had affected them. Only one of them was prepared to answer. When she was 12, looking at an iPod Touch Christmas present with her male cousin of the same age, her reaction, she threw the iPod across the room. She was terrified.
My Lords, I too welcome and thank my noble friend Baroness Jenkin of Kennington for bringing this debate to the floor today. And I draw the House's attention in the register to my interest in autism, as unsurprisingly it is that subject that I wish to address today. I want to focus on the safeguarding of autistic children in the education system. This will include both those with an autism diagnosis and those as yet undiagnosed, where often the need for an assessment and the subsequent plan to support the child through education, as outlined in the 2009 Autism Act, that support is needed in education right through transition from childhood to adulthood. Now, my noble friend Baroness Jenkin, in her representation of this debate today, outlined in some detail the government's definition of safeguarding in the context of education, so I won't repeat it now. But not for the first time I emphasise that autism is a spectrum, and the needs of the individual should be assessed by those with significant training and qualifications in autism and neurodiversity. Autism is different. It is a communication disorder. Both physical and mental bullying is common. The development of a sense of self can be slower than in the peer group. And idiosyncratic behaviour, such as echolalia, can attract unwanted hostile responses. Timely assessment, diagnosis and support is essential. Schools will struggle to carry out their statutory duties in respect of safeguarding until there is rapid improvement in this process. Research from Pro Bono Economics suggests that in 21-22, £60 million of public money was wasted on specialist educational needs and disability tribunals from people going forward who had actually come forward with an assessment or had not received one at all. And had those tribunals not responded to the request by rejecting them, it would have financed around 9,960 places in SEN units in mainstream schools each year from the money that has been wasted. So even when people do get an assessment, so many of them have to go to tribunals to try and get the support for the child that they desperately need. Ofsted, the Schools Inspectorate for England, describes what good safeguarding in an education setting should look like. And they say it's about the culture a school creates to keep its pupils safe so they can benefit fully. A positive and open safeguarding culture puts pupils' interests first, and everyone who works with children is vigilant in identifying risks and reporting concerns. Working openly and transparently with parents, local authorities and other stakeholders to protect pupils from serious harm both online and offline, and about taking prompt and proportionate action. Now, my lords, I too would like to make some comment or put some interest on the question of gender, and particularly the Cass report demonstrated the shockingly disproportionate high number of autistic children seen by the Portman and Tavistock Gender Identity Service. 48%, I'm going to repeat it, 48% of referrals to that clinic had autistic characteristics. And yet in the course of their work, nobody questioned why. What is going on here? I'm pleased to see the Department of Health is addressing the Cass report, and I'm grateful too to the Minister at the dispatch box today for the time she has allowed me in private to outline to her some of the similar problems experienced in some state schools for autistic children. Information given to me directly by the parents of those children. And as I've discussed with my noble friend, particularly as far as girls are concerned, parents have been locked out from what has been going on in schools that has affected their own children. And these have included things like breast binding, initiated by teachers without the parents' knowledge, referral to doctors who have prescribed puberty blockers, and of course things like changing pupils' names. Now, some of these issues have led to court cases, but we know that pubescent teenage girls sometimes struggle with the changes in their bodies and peer pressure to conform. How much more so for autistic girls who, on this complex issue, have found that so much more difficult. And I would like to just try and put some light on it with a quote from Autism and Gender Identity, written by Jane Galloway. She has suggested that with such a huge number of autistic girls identifying as trans, whether they be a boy or as a non-binary, although they will biologically be female or in rare cases intersex, we have to ask questions why this affects so many autistic children. Growing up in a culture soaked by internet porn, in which women are expected to conform to highly sexualized, performative femininity, young girls are often faced impossible beauty standards. They are seeing a world of toxic gender roles that speak neither for nor to them. And that also applies, I may add, to young lesbians, and as well as autistic girls. The temptation to reject all this outright is overwhelming. Add in the differentiated theory of mind, a theory of mind documented by Francesca Happe many years ago, which throws light on the way the autistic mind works. It's no wonder that many girls who are autistic, many of them will assume, because I am not this, I am that. And perhaps that was a question that should have been asked at the Tavistock Clinic. It's certainly a question that I hope in education we will ask as far as autistic girls in classrooms are concerned. And I hope in the guidelines that are to come, my noble friend will be able to influence that.
My Lord, I thank the noble Lady Baroness Jenkin for her cant around the issues, as she put it to me herself the other day. My Lords, I have always believed that there are very many ways of being human, and that we should bear that in mind when dealing with anyone who travels a different path from our own, and treat all with equal respect. This applies to gender identity and sexuality as well as every other characteristic. This principle underlies my reaction to the issues raised by many in this debate. When considering how to go about helping and protecting children as they find their way through life, I always go back to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and of course the best interests of the child principle, which is enshrined in UK law, thanks to the noble Lady Baroness Bottomley of Nettleston. And by the way, I'm quite surprised that I'm the first person in this debate to mention the Convention. Relevant to this debate is recommended number 25 in the concluding observations published in June this year by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child in its latest report on UK's compliance with the convention to which we are signed up. Quote, noting the decision taken by the state party to prevent the implementation of the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill, the committee recommends that the state party recognise the right to identity of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex children, and put in place measures to ensure that all adolescents can enjoy their freedom of expression and respect for their physical and psychological integrity, gender identity, and emerging autonomy. In this context, the state party should ensure that any decisions regarding systems of gender recognition for children are taken in close consultation with transgender children and in line with all children's rights, including the right to be heard and the right to identity, in accordance with their evolving capabilities, with free and informed consent and appropriate safeguards." Unquote. My Lords, in the light of our long-standing commitment to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, under which the committee evaluates our compliance every 5 years, will the UK government take notice of that recommendation? It is relevant to how schools respond when children express any kind of gender distress, uncertainty, or lack of conformity with others. It means that schools must listen to children, consult with them about how they wish to live, and as far as possible, ensure they are treated in the way that makes them feel most comfortable. When this is done, it helps to avoid distress and mental health problems in the future. The committee further recommended that we urgently address the long waiting times faced by transgender and gender questioning children in accessing specialist healthcare services, including mental health, to improve the quality of such services and ensure that the views of such children are taken into account in all decisions affecting their treatment. My Lords, I'd now like to use the opportunity of this debate to turn to a fundamental safeguarding concern of mine, which is to ensure that sexual abuse of children is never ignored or brushed under the carpet. That can only happen when there is a legal duty to report what is known or suspected, a deterrent from allowing fears of reputational damage to make a person keep silent. When a child has the courage to disclose sexual abuse, he or she just wants it to stop. If that doesn't happen, the child, as well as continuing to be abused, loses all trust in those in whom they have confided. In respect of this, I had great hopes of the Independent Inquiry on Child Sexual Abuse, ICSA, and it has not disappointed. However, when I looked at the government's response, I do not believe they have responded appropriately. ICSA's recommendation 13, entitled Mandatory Reporting, says this, quote, "The inquiry recommends that the UK government and Welsh government introduce legislation which places certain individuals, mandated reporters, under a statutory duty to report child sexual abuse, where they, 1, receive a disclosure of child sexual abuse from a child or perpetrator, 2, witness a child being sexually abused, or 3, observe recognised indicators of child sexual abuse. The following persons should be designated mandatory reporters. 1, any person working in regulated activity in relation to children under the Safeguarding and Vulnerable Groups Act 2006, as amended. 2, any person working in a position of trust, as defined by the Sexual Offences Act 2003, as amended. And 3, police officers. For the purposes of mandatory reporting, child sexual abuse should be interpreted as any act that would be an offence under the Sexual Offences Act 2003, where the alleged victim is a child under the age of 18. Unquote. There follow exceptions, which I won't go into. And then ICSA says, quote, where the child is under the age of 13, a report must always be made. Reports should be made to either local authority children's social care or the police as soon as is practicable, unquote. And here's the crucial bit, quote, it should be a criminal offence for mandated reporters to fail to report child sexual abuse where they are in receipt of a disclosure of child sexual abuse from a child or perpetrator or witness a child being sexually abused. Unquote. That, my lords, is what I was hoping for. Initially, the government response sounded hopeful. It said, quote, we accept the need for mandatory reporting. The government has agreed to implement a mandatory reporting regime for child sexual abuse, which will be informed by a full public consultation, unquote. It further says, quote, we agree that implementing a new mandatory reporting duty could improve the protection and safeguarding of children, as well as holding to account those who fail in their responsibilities. A successful reporting regime will ensure that the individuals and organisations with responsibility to safeguard children provide a robust and consistent response to abuse, putting the needs of children first. The consultation outcome was published in May this year, and the government published its guidance called Keeping Children Safe in Education in September. Having read this guidance carefully, I would say that it is, on the whole, excellent, well-written, clear and comprehensive, but it lacks one thing and has one inconsistency, which is crucial, and I'll come to that in a minute. It says that if staff have any concerns about a child's welfare, they should act on them immediately, follow their organisation's child protection policy, and speak to the designated safeguarding lead or deputy. Then outlines the actions which can be taken, including making a referral to statutory services. It tells staff what to do if the DSL is not available, speaking to a member of the senior leadership and/or local authority children's social care. Staff should not assume a colleague or another professional will take action and should share information that might be critical in keeping children safe. And it gives criteria for that. It then goes on to describe what local authorities should do. I was pleased to read that it makes clear that the Data Protection Act 2018 and UK General Data Protection Regulations do not prevent the sharing of information for the purposes of keeping the children safe and promoting their welfare. It says, quote, "Fears about sharing information must not be allowed to stand in the way of the need to safeguard and promote the welfare of children," unquote. So far, so excellent. However, I noted the difference between all this advice and the section on female genital mutilation, and this is what it says. Whilst all staff should speak to the designated safeguarding lead or a deputy with regard to any concerns about female genital mutilation, FGM, there is a specific legal duty on teachers. If a teacher in the course of their work in the profession discovers that an act of FGM appears to have been carried out on a girl under 18, the teacher must report this to the police. In other words, it's against the law to fail to report that a child has been physically mutilated, but it's not against the law to fail to report or act on the knowledge or suspicion that a child has been sexually abused. And that's much more widespread. My lords, I wonder if the minister can tell me, what is the difference?
Well, my lords, it's a pleasure to follow Baroness Walmsley, and I associate myself with much of the content of her speech, including noting about the United Nations Convention of the Child, which is so important. I'd also like to congratulate Baroness Jenkins on securing this debate today on such an important subject, safeguarding children in schools. Safeguarding has a set of specific meanings regarding the protection of children and vulnerable adults from abuse, neglect and harm. And although I am no longer a working teacher, as Lord Hampton, who made many excellent points in his debate, I did do 35 years at the Chalkface, so I know a little bit about it. I'm going to talk about what I read in the Times Ed supplement that recently identified the 7 key safeguarding areas that schools should be concerned with now, as mentioned earlier by Baroness Brinton. So, child sexual abuse material. A recent report from the Internet Watch Foundation found a 64% increase in reported web pages containing confirmed child sexual abuse images in 2021 compared to 2020. Almost 7 out of 10 instances involving children aged 11 to 13, and 97% of the images were of girls. It's absolutely vital that everyone working with children is aware of online risks, has appropriate training, and ensures children have suitable routes to support and reporting. Next, there's child sexual violence and harassment. The excellent organisation Girl Guiding released figures in 2021 that stated that their members, 2/3 of girls and young women, experienced sexual harassment in school. Schools should maintain the attitude that such behaviours could already be taking place and foster environments where children feel safe and empowered to report abuse. In terms of extremism and radicalisation, the number of children arrested in relation to terrorism offences has reached its highest level since records began. According to the Home Office, 16% of arrests under the Terrorism Act 2000 in the year ending 2022 were aged under 18. Young people are particularly vulnerable to radicalisation, and schools need to be aware of key factors: social isolation, precarious emotional ties, and violent peers. Labour have called for the government to provide an update to the counter-extremism strategy, because it hasn't been updated since 2015. Although the Prevent strategy has been updated, there's need for a wider counter-extremism strategy. A growing issue, my lords, and one that we've talked about many times in this place, is domestic abuse. It's been reported that 62% of children living with domestic abuse are directly harmed by the perpetrator of the abuse. One in 5 children have lived with an adult perpetuating domestic abuse. And by witnessing the abuse of others or by being harmed directly, children may experience a wide range of severe and long-lasting effects. All staff within schools must follow their school's child protection policy and contact the police if they suspect a child to be in danger. My lords, a term that has become increasingly used to describe safeguarding issues but didn't exist when I began my teaching career in Brixton in the 1980s is adverse childhood experiences, usually shortened now to the acronym ACEs. They include a range of experiences, including being the victim of abuse or neglect, parental abandonment through separation or divorce, or having a parent with a mental health condition. And several studies have shown if a person has experienced 4 or more ACEs compared with someone with no ACEs, they are more likely to experience poor health and well-being into adulthood. Another safeguarding issue is trauma, which can occur when a child witnesses or experiences overwhelming negative events. Developmental trauma includes children who are neglected, abused, forced to live with family violence, or experience high parental conflict. And it affects all aspects of a child's development, including the brain, body, emotions, memory, relationships, learning and behaviour. And schools provide the opportunity for children to experience safe and predictable environments and to interact with staff and peers with kindness and compassion. And another issue that has grown hugely in the past decade, and particularly during and after the experiences of the pandemic, mental health issues in children and young people. The NHS identified 1 in 6 children aged 5 to 16 as having a probable mental health problem in July 2021, an increase from 1 in 9 in 2017. This, my lords, is equivalent to about 5 children in every classroom. Schools should help children to develop good relationships and build resilience when dealing with setbacks. And all staff need to be given training on common issues, including anxiety, low mood and depression, self-harm and conduct disorders. The government's education plans only aim for mental health support for children in half of its schools. Labour's plan is to ensure specialist mental health support in every school to stop problems before they escalate. 5 years ago, the government committed to producing guidance for schools to support children who are questioning their gender. There are a range of views, we've heard them here today, about how best to support young people, but the clear consensus is that guidance is needed, as mentioned by my noble friend Baroness Morris, and in fuller detail by my noble friend Lord Cashman. I support many of his comments, particularly regarding his observations about his personal experience, of which he spoke most movingly. My lords, during the passage of the Schools Bill, which didn't complete its journey through the legislative process, one area that should have made it into law was the provision of a homeschool register, a long overdue addition to safeguarding measures. During the passage of the bill, I spoke about the increasing number of children receiving an education outside of the classroom and how they could be missing out on benefits that a school environment brings. vital safeguards in helping to make sure children aren't being taught in unsuitable or dangerous environments. Allied to this register are the large numbers of children who have not returned to school since the pandemic. Last year, more than 1 in 5 children were persistently absent from school. It was quite disturbing, therefore, on Tuesday to hear from a permanent secretary in the Department for Education that the DfE was blocked by Downing Street from legislating for a register of children not in school. This government has consistently failed to get them back to school. Every day of learning matters, and it appears the block on this legislation came directly from Number 10, despite cross-party support and a request from the DfE. My Lords, I can clearly state the next Labour government will legislate to identify children out of school and ensure families and schools get the support needed to guarantee an excellent education for every child and to seek to safeguard those children and young people. We will bring an annual safeguarding review in for schools in England as concerns about children's safety and well-being are being missed due to infrequent Ofsted inspections. There's been a promising, positive reaction to this idea of annual safeguarding reviews, and we will consult closely with the education community. Safeguarding is the number one priority of everyone in education.
My Lords, I'd like to join other noble lords in thanking my noble friend Baroness Jenkin of Kennington for securing this debate on the importance of safeguarding in our schools. Your Lordships have set me an impossible task in trying to address all of the points raised, so anything I'm unable to cover in the time available, I will follow up in writing. My Lords, we heard this afternoon some very powerful and reflective speeches from across this House, and I would like to thank all noble lords who contributed to this important debate. And as we heard, safeguarding our children both inside and outside of school is absolutely crucial. And as the world evolves, so the safeguarding challenges that our children, safeguarding risks our children face, and the challenges our schools face evolve with them. As your Lordships are aware, all schools and colleges in England must have regard to the statutory safeguarding guidance, keeping children safe in education. The guidance sets out the policies and procedures that teachers and leaders should follow to protect children whilst in school. Our schools and colleges are also part of a wider framework of safeguarding that includes local authorities, health and police, who each have statutory duties to safeguard and promote the welfare of children. Safeguarding is everybody's responsibility, and everyone who comes into contact with children and their families has a role to play in identifying concerns, sharing information, and taking prompt action. Given the focus of the debate, I am going to start my remarks in relation to issues around the government's gender questioning guidance, but I will aim to cover some of the wider points raised in the debate. If I may, I'd also like particularly to thank the noble Lady Baroness Morris, who I think was the first to raise this subject, but also for the tone and her reflection about how much has improved over many years. And I know she would agree with me that we have a lot to owe every teacher for their part in that. A number of noble lords have raised the issue of schools supporting the social transition of pupils who are questioning their gender, including my noble friend Lord Farmer, my noble friend Lord Jackson of Peterborough, my noble friend Lord Shinkwin. If I may, I was sorry to hear his remarks on the re-emergence of discrimination towards disabled people. And I'd also like to thank my noble friend Lord Roberts for his historical perspective on these issues. And obviously how we respond to such requests is an important safeguarding and welfare question. And as your lordships pointed out, recent years have seen a large increase in children seeking support. The number of children seeking medical support for gender dysphoria was 20 times higher in 2022 than a decade ago. Schools, of course, are not taking decisions about clinical support, but that does not mean that decisions about social transition can be taken lightly. Actions like changing names and pronouns are serious and can have a wider impact. And the Cass review highlighted the importance of safeguarding, stressing that social transition is not a neutral act. It may have significant effects on the child or young person in terms of their psychological functioning. But the review also says that not supporting social transition is also not a neutral act. There is not clear information on the long-term effects. And that's the background to the guidance that we've been working on carefully and will be publishing for consultation shortly. I'm not going to preempt that publication in this debate, but I can reassure noble lords that the issues raised today have very much been considered in its development. Safeguarding and welfare will be absolutely central to decisions taken by schools, considering the implications for individuals and for the wider school. And in that context, biological sex is vitally important. Single-sex spaces, as raised by my noble friend Baroness Eaton, need to be maintained. School sport, which was touched on by my noble friends Lord Sandhurst and Lord Wriothesley, must be safe and fair. It's also vital that parents should be engaged in decision-making about their children. And that's a principle at the heart of other school processes, such as deciding on support for children with special educational needs. And it's just as important here. Parents are the ones who know their children and their wider lives best. And I have to disagree with the noble Lady Baroness Brinton about keeping this information from parents, except in absolutely exceptional circumstances. I should also emphasise that we will be holding a consultation on the guidance. While I am confident that we've considered the issues raised, we really do want to gather a full range of views, and I hope that your lordships and members of the public will respond to let us know the extent to which it clarifies these issues for schools. Because as we heard from the noble Lady Baroness Morris and others, there is a central point about certainty for teachers and clarity for teachers about how they should respond to these very sensitive and difficult issues. The noble Lord Cashman asked me to clarify that we won't repeat the mistakes of the past. And just to be clear, the guidance will aim to both support and protect all pupils, including those who are questioning their gender. And one of the key principles that's guided this work is that schools and colleges should be respectful and tolerant places where children are treated with compassion and understanding and where bullying is never tolerated. But at the heart of this guidance is child safety and well-being. And as I mentioned, the interim Cass report confirmed that we do need better information about the long-term implications of social transition, which is why the government is advocating a cautious approach. My noble friend Baroness Browning talked about the gap in evidence in relation particularly to girls with autism in this area, and the noble Lord Cashman asked that we would be driven by verifiable evidence. And I think one of the challenges in this area, and I hope the noble Lord would accept that there is insufficient evidence and there's even less uncontested evidence. So it's really important that we work to fill that gap. But at the heart of the guidance will be the best interests of the child and clarity for teachers and other staff in schools about how to respond. Going more broadly to the issues in the RSHE curriculum, Noble Lords have raised the issue of sharing those materials with parents. We have brought forward the review of the RSHE curriculum. As your Lordships, I think, know, we've appointed an independent panel to advise the Secretary of State on the introduction of age limits on teaching sensitive topics. And the Secretary of State wrote to all schools in October clarifying how schools can share materials with parents while remaining within copyright law. This was something that was raised in particular by my noble friend Lord Jackson of Peterborough, and I would be delighted to meet with him and discuss the complaints which he's been made aware of and how the department has responded. And also he mentioned that the School of Sexuality Education was a contributor to the department's guidance. If he can point me to that reference, because we've checked our list of expert contributors and they don't appear to be on it, but if he has evidence of that, clearly I'll happily take that away if he could write to me on that. In relation to the letter that the Secretary of State wrote, it also set out that the Copyright Act allows schools to copy resources proportionately for the purposes of explaining to parents what is being taught, including via a parent portal or a presentation. The letter was also clear that where parents can't access the parent portal or presentation, schools can provide copies of materials to parents to take home on request, providing parents agree to a statement that they will not copy the content or share it further except as authorised under copyright law. The points made in this letter will be reflected in the updated statutory RSHE guidance, which schools will have a duty to have regard to. My noble friend Baroness Jenkin asked about the timing of the publication of the guidance and the consultation, so we will be consulting on it in the near future, and we expect the guidance to be published in 2024, with the consultation being launched early in the new year. Turning to online safety in schools, my noble friend the Earl of Leicester and the noble Baroness Lady Wilcox raised the issues of children's access to pornography, which obviously is a very serious concern for all the reasons that your Lordships have set out this afternoon. We've updated the Teaching Online Safety in Schools non-statutory guidance this year, which covers how to teach all aspects of internet safety, not just those relating to relationships, sex and health. Your Lordships are aware that the Secretary of State has committed to introducing a ban on mobile phones in schools. My noble friend Baroness Jenkin asked for the timing on that. We expect to provide more information on that early in 2024. And obviously and importantly, the Online Safety Act takes a zero-tolerance approach to the protection of children and will ensure that platforms are held responsible for the content that they host. The noble Lord Cashman, also raised the question about whether schools would return to the days of Section 28. And I can reassure the noble Lord that that is absolutely not the case. The RSHE guidance is clear that pupils should be taught LGBT content at an age-appropriate point in their education, that they should know about protected characteristics within the Equality Act, but that we do need to provide clarity for schools and colleges, and importantly reassurance for parents on the content that's being taught. Turning to mandatory reporting, which was raised by the noble Baronesses Lady Brinton and Lady Walmsley. I think there might have been a slight confusion in relation to the CASE, the Keeping Children Safe in Education guidance, which obviously has been published and therefore predates the government's publication in relation to the child sexual abuse mandatory reporting duty, which we have committed to introduce. We have committed to working across government to consult on how this will work in practice, which is sensitive to the wider impact of this and burdens, and we will work through whether the action is needed at an organisational or an individual level, or indeed at both. And in developing our proposals, which we have consulted on, we did look carefully at experiences of other countries that have mandatory reporting, including Australia and Canada, as the Noble Baroness Lady Brinton asked. My noble friend Baroness Jenkin and the Noble Lady Baroness Wilcox raised the very important issue of children's mental health, and obviously that is a real priority and a concern. We are investing an additional $2.3 billion a year into NHS mental health services, which will help, by March 2024, which will help 345,000 more children and young people to access mental health support. We're also committed to supporting schools with our offer of senior mental health lead training, which has already been accessed by over 14,000 settings. But of course the other side of mental health is resilience and well-being, and I'd just like to pick up on the comments of my noble friends Lord Sandhurst and Lord Wriothesley about the importance of sport and PE and indeed wider extracurricular activities in relation to building children's and young people's resilience. Turning to the issues of extremism in relation to safeguarding in schools raised by my noble friend Lord Farmer and the Noble Lady Baroness Udin. The House may be aware that I and fellow ministers have had several discussions with faith and non-faith primary and secondary school providers, particularly in relation to the impact of the conflict between Israel and Hamas on both Muslim and Jewish and other students in a range of settings. And as a result of these meetings, we've agreed to prioritise actions to tackle inappropriate misinformation and disinformation, particularly on social media, about the conflict, and we will be issuing guidance to teachers and schools on promoting tolerance and addressing racism and anti-Semitism. We've also updated our Educate Against Hate website, which provides resources and lesson plans for schools to support them in holding these very sensitive discussions. My noble friend raised the issue of school protests held in school hours, and the government is absolutely clear that it is not acceptable that children are not in school because of political activism, and I'm aware, having spoken to head teachers, how much pressure they are under from some parents and indeed some colleagues to allow children out of school. I think it's very important as a government that we're clear that we support them and that they are doing the right thing to make sure that their children are in school. The Noble Lady Baroness Udin raised some concerns about Prevent. I can only disagree with the vast majority of what she said. Prevent plays an important part in safeguarding, and actually, going back to Baroness Morris's opening comments about how far we've come, we are able to intervene much earlier, which any parent or any child, any parent of a child at risk of being drawn into extremist ideologies, whether far right or otherwise, would be grateful for early intervention, and we feel that it's a really important plank and part of progress. I did want to say a word about attendance, which the Noble Lord, Lord Hampton and others raised. I think this is perhaps, there's always a competition to be the most important thing, but this is certainly one of the most important things for us in the department, partly because of the issues of safety. Children are safest when they're in school, partly because of the impact on their education, and we're very grateful to the Children's Commissioner for her recent work on the impact on children's attainment of missing school, but also because we know that children become invisible to all services when they're not in school. School is such an important place, and it was I was going to say moving, genuinely moving to listen to Lord Hampton talk about the care that teachers take, spotting how children are in the playground, in the corridor, in the classroom, and that's where we need them to be. My noble friend asked me about whether we would consider schools and academy trusts issuing fixed penalty notices for poor attendance. Obviously, schools can ask local authorities to issue those fines, and local authorities have the legal responsibility to do that. If my noble friend has examples where that's not working well in practice, obviously I'd be happy to take those up. I'm out of time. Just quickly to say to Lord Hampton that we do support the Children's Commissioner's recommendation on mandatory participation in the attendance data, but 87% of schools send in their data voluntarily. And finally, I'd just like to thank my noble friend, Baroness Bottomley, for her incredible work on the Children Act, which has been such an extraordinary influence in this country, and to share her recognition for the work of social workers, health visitors and teachers. In closing, my lords, I'd just like to thank once again all noble lords who spoke in this debate, and on your lordship's behalf to thank all those who work in schools and teachers in particular for their work every hour, every day, keeping our children safe.
My lords, I think we've had rather more than just a cant around these issues, but I think we've had some very powerful contributions from many noble lords with a wide variety of focuses and expertise. Like my noble friend the Minister, I was particularly interested to hear the background from Baroness Bottomley to the history of the Children Acts and the importance of consistency. We've all mentioned Lord Hampton's lived experience, as we know it is, at the coalface. Baroness Morris, we're very grateful to her for bringing the importance of the guidance for gender questioning and to hear the response from the Minister. I think she's covered all the issues, but sports, single-sex spaces, pornography, RHSC materials and parental access, autism and the understanding particularly of girls, sexual abuse, Lord Roberts' perspective as a historian, gender distress and how to deal with it in the school environment. And I'm grateful to Noble Lord Cashman for advertising the debate so widely on social media. And I think we're all grateful to the Noble Lord the Minister for her typically thoughtful response to the debate. My Lords, I beg to move.
The question is that this motion be agreed to as many of that opinion shall so content. Contrary not content, the contents of it.